I'll be honest with you, I chose this episode to review in a pretty haphazard way. I took a look at the list of NuWho episodes with the express purpose of finding a crap one, but not a crap one that was complicated or deep in how shit it was, no complex themes or politics or dark ideas, just a bit of shoddy NuWho to examine and skewer. After a few scrolls up and down, my eye settled on this episode and I went, ah yes, the one with the shitty CGI Mark Gatiss scorpion, and well, the deal was pretty much instantly sealed, and well, wasn't I delighted when it turned out this was a very weak episode with all of its features very much obvious in their poorness. It's a cliche-laden, surface-level, almost first-draft level script with basic character interactions, absurdly weak dialogue, laughably dubious science, and no real interest in exploring the issues it was bringing up, all made worse with weak directing, some of the worst effects the series has ever done. I mean, on Invasion of the Dinosaurs level here, definitely. All of these will be discussed in detail on their own, of course, and I'll admit this episode is just bad rather than god-awful. There's nothing offensive or insulting about it, it's just a bad bit of Doctor Who. And in particular, a bad bit of NuWho, given how emblematic of many of the revival's problems it is. So, here we are. The Doctor Who review guide looks at a bad episode. Sometimes you just have to go for what comes naturally. Series 3 is a very mixed bag of a series overall. Some of it is excellent, like the Human Nature two-parter or Utopia, and some of it is just downright awful. The Dalek two-parter and much of the series finale immediately springs to mind. As a series as a whole, it suffers from some poor decisions made with Martha's character that put her forever in Rose's shadow, and left us with a frequently uncomfortable spectacle of the companion lusting after the Doctor while he was still clearly not over the one who came before. This was a mistake, and as this is an episode in which Martha's character is fairly prominent, it's probably a good time to talk about why, at least a bit. Martha was certainly a character that started with the right idea, to move on a bit from Rose the infallible that featured the year before, to someone obviously capable, but who nevertheless needed to fully adapt to TARDIS travel, and also someone who had to prove themselves to the Doctor. The idea was fine, but there were crucial mistakes made, the principal one being, as I mentioned, that she quickly got the hots for Tennant's bods, which did reduce her agency as a character, and meant the way it and the relationship could be explored also hobbled. It also meant, as I said, the Doctor would spend the whole time moping about Rose, and thus Martha would be spent lusting after someone who wasn't really interested in all that implied, and meant she would always be the one who wasn't Rose. It meant that the character's potential was simply not met, as the natural point of her winning the Doctor's approval for her obvious ability and capability was not possible. The Doctor wasn't willing to give it because he wasn't able to move on from Rose, and it wouldn't have been enough for Martha anyway because she wanted rather more than that she wasn't really going to ever be able to have. Thus the character arc was never really able to move in the way it probably should have done. Another issue was that RTT clearly felt he had hit onto a winner with certain elements of Rose's character and story arc and decided to fall back on them with Martha, the family unit who'd mostly be sceptical of the Doctor, the sense of frustration with her life, etc. and so forth. The former is very relevant to this episode as Martha's arc in it revolves around her relationship with her family to an extent. Her overbearing mother, her ambitious sister, her brother who doesn't really do anything, but he's there. And well, I can't help sitting there thinking this is a bit been there, done that, and I preferred it when it was Jackie and Mickey. Of course, another issue was good old-fashioned incompetence, and the weak characters and confused arcs for her family members do not help proceedings, and this is somewhat true of Martha herself. But her overall series arc is something that better fits in with discussion of upper episodes, so I'll keep my discussion in this video the stuff that's relevant to this episode. My point is that as a character I like her potential quite a bit more than I like her execution, and it's a shame because there was a real chance to show the versatility of the series, how so many different types of companions can fit seamlessly into the role, as the classic series demonstrated in spades throughout its run. Arguably NuWho has never really demonstrated this, with pretty much every companion being various shades of contemporary Earth, but at least with say Donna, the character arc and interactions were very different, and certainly did not live in the shadow of Rose as Martha unfortunately did. With that intro out of the way and the promise of more later when we get to the relevant bits of the episode, let's look at the episode itself, starting as we always do with the production. Directing this was Richard Clarke, a name you'd probably recognise from the directed by credit on the beginning of this episode, otherwise probably not. He directed 4 episodes, 2 from this series, Gridlock and this episode obviously, and then 2 from Series 6, The Doctor's Wife and Night Terrors. I will level with you and say I've not seen any of those episodes in a very long time. In fact, for Night Terrors, I don't think I've ever seen it since original broadcast. So as for his original directing style and ability, well, you've got me there. All I can say is the job he done on this episode is not great, but how much of that is his fault and how much of it is just being handed a bucket of rotten fish and being asked not to make it stink, well, I couldn't say. Some of his decisions are poor, no question. The editing in various scenes is sloppy and do not help the idea that this episode is just a bit of farce. The cliched words on the page can frequently just translate into looking like parody, for instance. The initial transformation scene is a great example of this. The over-the-top emphasis on several moments, most hilariously a giant red button to start the thing, well either that or a set off a buzzer to stop the Tennant initial audition, one of the two. There are also several bizarre moments. Clearly he had no idea how to portray the giant scorpion's life-sucking ability, certainly within a way that would have been portrayable on the budget, so yeah, clearly he had no idea how to portray that. His solution is to cut from the screaming lady to other characters looking horrified as it happens to the bad special effect body being dumped, which is just so blatant it's funny. If you can't afford an effect, there are ways around that. In the Auton attack in Spearhead from Space, they couldn't afford breakable glass, so they used clever editing to get around it, so you'd only notice if you're particularly paying attention to that sort of thing. Whereas here it's just so obvious, there's a sound effect in the background as we look at the Doctor and the code being horrified, it just kind of becomes amusing, really. Broadly, though, Clark is not held by what's on the page. The chase sequences are just cliche-ridden rubbish, and it's not hard to see why he couldn't get tension out of the Doctor playing the organ, for instance. It was also not helped by the appalling effects. Whatever tension remains from most of these scenes is sucked out by the appalling-looking CGI scorpion that kills whatever remaining suspension of disbelief you might have had. It's not a good job, not even close, but I suspect he may have had one hand tied behind his back in a way. Speaking of which, CGI. See, make no mistake, this is terrible. You can see it just as well as I can, unless you sort of have sight issues, in which case, it's bad, take my word for it. But I think it's very much a sign of much larger issues, and why the hilariously dated effects in most of early NuWho are to me less forgivable than some of the ropier effects in the classic series. See, in the noughties, CGI still felt like a new toy to play with. Yeah, Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park had been over a decade before. It's not that CGI itself was a novelty anymore, but more of it was around this time it was becoming more accessible, especially to television productions. A great sell of NuWho was that it would have had state-of-the-art effects and not cardboard and bubble wrap like the classic series had. And yes, despite how little a secret I've made of how much I prefer the classic series to NuWho, yes, the classic series effects were frequently unimpressive. Sometimes they could be very good for their time and budget, yes, but they could also be frequently poor even with those considerations. The thing is, though, I think the attitude the production team of early NuWho had was, well,
I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me. It'll happen to you. No way, man. We're gonna keep on rocking forever.
Yeah, pretty much that. The classic series now looks ropey and dated, but that'll never happen to us with our state-of-the-art CGI to play with. Well, 2 decades on, and yes, it's just as dated as some of the lamer effects of the classic series, and frankly much more so because bad CGI will also always look worse than bad practical effects, because as rubbish as the latter can look, it's at least something that's there. The Mud Beast is basically the only bad thing in the caves of Androzani, for instance, but with a bit of clever lighting and shot choice, because it's a physical thing, it nevertheless has enough presence to do its job. Whereas a CGI equivalent would have had no presence, it would look like it isn't even there, and part of the problem with bad CGI is that it can look like it isn't lit right either, which hurts it even further. Now, this isn't a problem for the odd spaceship establishing shot or the occasional flying Dalek, because those things are brief and are often gone as soon as they're there. They're just there to support the story, not be the main focus of them. The problem is when you decide this new toy is worth basing your entire episode around, and that's the lot you're banking on working, and a hell of a risk you're taking if it doesn't. That's why, to use the classic series again, Invasion of the Dinosaurs gets so much flack for its poor effects, showing this was not a NuWho specific phenomenon, even if it was much more common. There are probably worse effects throughout the classic series than those dinosaurs, but because they're the most prominent part of the story, and while a lot of the time they're all we're looking at, it becomes all the more glaring. This episode is a great example of that theory in action, and the reason why we're showing off a shiny toy to have the kind of monster that had not been possible to portray in a way that didn't look ridiculous in the classic series makes it all the more hilariously ironic of how terrible it looks. Not all CGI in the 2000s does look terrible. For instance, you can say what you like about the Star Wars prequels, but much of the effects from those movies does hold up really well even today. The same goes for the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, frequently held up as an example of the good old days of CGI from that time. That does, however, correlate strongly with budget, in a way that isn't necessarily the case today. Now obviously a higher budget does help even today, but these days, even on Doctor Who's budget, they can pull off pretty decent CGI by most standards, and have been able to a good few years, arguably since sort of the Moffat era really. But into the 2000s it did matter. It mattered in the same way practical effects depended on it in the 70s and 80s. With a high budget you got Star Wars, with a low budget you got Underworld or Warriors of the Deep. Likewise, with a high budget you got those movies I mentioned before. With a low budget, you got this. So they're a bit enamoured with their new toy when they really shouldn't have been, and decided to base an entire episode around set effects, and well, here we are. And well, frankly, all of that was so I could give a bit of credence to what I actually have to say about this thing, and that's that it looks shit. I mean, really shit, among the worst Doctor Who effects ever, and I mean really the worst. But, well, that's about it. I don't really have much to say about the technical details about why it looks shit, because A, I'm not an expert in that kind of thing, and B, what's the fucking point? It looks that bad. What is there to say? So I thought I'd talk about what led up to this point. And yes, the CGI in early NuWho does as a whole look embarrassing, and the hubris in thinking it would always be this grand dividing line with what came before is equally embarrassing, and it led us to this fucking thing. Now, I will say that I think what the clinch for why it fails so badly is how desperate it is trying to be horrifying. But one can simply apply the doth protest too much solution to see why this fails, as how over the top it is part of the reason it fails so badly. But ultimately, how many ways are there to say something looks like it came out of a bad PS2 game? Basing a story on a special effect like this is always a bad idea because chances are it won't be good enough to hold up on whose budget, and when it doesn't hold up, it tanks the story's credibility. That ended up being as embarrassing as it is in a story like this was the idea of Doctor Who's grand new era of effects ending up precisely as it always would. And well, we look at this back nearly 20 years later and laugh, don't we? Anywho, what of course makes this even worse is that the script is not exactly brilliant on paper, which further reduces the credibility of what we're seeing on the screen. If the stupid CGI Scorpion was bouncing around on the service of an interesting plot or character study or thematic journey or whatever, then you just shrug and accept it. Unfortunately, this episode does not manage that, which makes watching the stupid CGI Scorpion going around an exercise in both absurdity and stupidity. I'll start with one or two positives, and one or two is about as good as we're going to get. In actuality, it's nothing to do with the script, but because it's character based, it fits here, so here we are. The performances in the episode are actually on the whole pretty decent, as good as they can be, or the quality of character work and dialogue certainly. David Tennant is on good form here, certainly bringing the requisite levels of energy to his performance. It does a good job in making clear how easily the Doctor handles these kind of situations. He also brings as much depth as he can to the very much without depth material about mortality and all that. However weak I find the Doctor's position on paper, Tennant nevertheless brings it the weight and weariness alike it needs. Freema Agyeman, and sorry if I pronounced that wrong, I've never actually managed to look up how it's pronounced, so sorry. She also does well in giving Martha a great deal of energy and drive, as to allow the character to prove her ability, but also does her best in giving her depth as well. I say does her best because it's not like she has anything on the page to work with, but I would just be repeating myself. As for the supporting actors, Mark Gatiss does a good job actually, I think. I mean, it's blatantly obvious a mate's hire from RTD, but he nevertheless I think does a great job of having to portray both a much older man and a man his own age who's nevertheless still mentally that much older man. It's a difficult line to tread, but I think he does it well. Clear examples of awkwardness in dealing with Tish, for instance, and that he hasn't flirted with a young woman in a long time, and has kind of lost how to do it, despite the fact it clearly comes natural to him in a way. As for Martha's family, Adjoa Ando as Martha's mum is a bit of a victim of her poor dialogue. Some of the lines she says are so weak nobody could have made them sound good, but whatever deficiencies in the line reading are made up for in her physical performance. Her facial expressions are fantastic, really treading the line between the air of authority she's trying to hold and how it can crumble when the safety of her family is on the line. And when she smacks the Doctor like that, you really do believe it. The other small thing I wish to praise is the thematic ideas at play here. Now I, as you'll shortly discover, do not wish to praise either the plot ideas or the thematic execution, so don't confuse those things, but the thematic idea, that of exploring death and mortality, and bringing that around to look at the Doctor's character, is a perfectly good one, and one that makes sense within the context of the series' wide arc for him. The 10th Doctor's armour being chipped away a little was always a good way to explore him, and as I said, Tennant does a good job of displaying that even if the script doesn't. But yeah, overall idea, fine. So, what went wrong here? First of all, and I did sort of touch on this before, but I'll touch on it again, the idea of basing the entire episode around this creature was a stupid idea, as it would leave the episode relying on effects of dubious quality, but also that it would leave the episode relying entirely on an idea that ended up being pretty dubious on its own, even on paper. And frankly, I'm not sure at what point, if there was one, where everyone involved clockfoot giant scorpion with Mark Gatiss's head was going to be fucking ridiculous. The problem here is that, well, Doctor Who might not always be the most serious of programmes, but it also rarely thrives on just going balls to the wall with, well, let's not beat around the bush, stupid concepts, and this unfortunately fails even the most basic sniff test. Even if the effects did end up being good, it still would have had already set the episode back, because it's just a ridiculous idea. I mean, surely I don't need to explain why giant scorpion with a face of Mark Gatiss is a stupid idea. Please tell me you understand that. It's helped even less by a few things. Firstly, the effects, but I shall not flog that particular dead horse any further. Secondly, writer Stephen Greenhorn, who I don't think I've mentioned yet, so yeah, he wrote it, seems intent to further make the creature seem ridiculous by giving it the ability to make villainous comments and threats, as if coming out of a flipping Disney movie or something. And thirdly, even for Doctor Who, the science behind this thing is pretty fucking stupid. Most of it is just some of the most absurdly weak technobabble the series has done. Obviously, we're dealing with science fiction, there's always going to be a certain amount of technobabble, but you can disguise it a little better than hypersonic sound waves creating a state of resonance. Now, I don't know much about science, but I take the view that even if even I am noticing something as complete fucking nonsense, then you're doing it very wrong. But worse than that, technobabble is the attempt at actual science.
Is it alien?
No, for once it's strictly human in origin.
Human? How can it be human?
Probably from dormant genes in Lazarus' DNA. The energy field in this thing must have reactivated them. Now it looks like they're becoming dominant.
So it's a throwback?
Some option that evolution rejected for you millions of years ago.
Okay, yeah, except that's not how evolution works. And once again, if I'm noticing this, then it's pretty fucking blatant. Evolution is not a conscious choice made. It's not a multiple choice pub quiz question. A for bipedal, B for scorpion, etc. Evolution is adaptations to environments, and those adaptations that are best suited for survival are the ones that thrive. Humans evolved the ability to walk upright, communicate, use tools, because those were the abilities that allowed our ancestors to survive when those who didn't have those abilities went extinct. It wasn't as if fate that particular evolutionary path that our genes thoroughly decided on. Species evolve over millions of years. That particular path is not already chosen and inside the genes of individuals. And even if we accept that bullshit is the case, why would an alternative path be this giant fucking scorpion? First of all, this giant scorpion's anatomy and features are so different from us that evolutionarily their path would have been so radically different that any human resemblance would have been unlikely to survive. Secondly, I tried googling the last common ancestor between humans and scorpions, and the only actual answer I could get was that stupid AI thing Google does now, which suggested it was about over 500 million years ago. Now, even considering that AI thing is usually wrong, that's nevertheless such a separation between us and scorpions that it gives the entire thing a whiff of total and utter bullshit. We're talking about creatures that are completely theoretical and are about 400 million years before the dinosaurs even came about. Probably, I don't know the maths myself, but you get the idea. But well, even if it is wrong, at least the AI was willing to entertain the question, when it appeared actual people were not, which should tell you most of what you need to know. Oh, and how are resonance waves or whatever causing dominant genes to be activated? Again, I'm no scientist, but I take the view if I'm noticing your obvious bollocks, then it's very obvious bollocks. Another area the episode found us with is the theme. As I said, good idea definitely, but poor execution. The idea is supposed to be exploring death and mortality and humanity's relationship with them. The whole plot comes out because of Dr. Lazarus. Yes, really, they did actually name the guy who wanted to cheat death Lazarus. That's his actual name. That is what we're dealing with in this episode. Anyway, the plot comes about because he wants a way to restore his youth and cheat death. Again, the idea is fine, but the problem is his motivations are weak and his character not really explored enough to make it work. First of all, the episode actually does seem kind of confused about whether it's really about eternal youth or about cheating death. The presentation of the experiment and the reaction to it point to the former, but the thematic stuff, and frankly all logic about how the character is portrayed, points to the latter. But more importantly, the motivations are just confused. Tying it back to World War II experience seems to be little more than name-dropping historical event people would understand, and well setting up the location for the finale, but we don't get enough of a feeling of how that experience changed him into devoting his entire life into preventing his own death. Our feeling of his experience in the Blitz was that it happened, and it wasn't very nice. That's about it, really. Likewise, his reactions to his change and the consequences are extremely basic and belie one of the major problems of the episode, the lack of depth. His responses are cliched and generic. He doesn't care about the human loss as a result. He thinks this is a great scientific achievement, etc. and so forth. There's no dive into the deep-rooted reasons behind his fear of death, what that means for his whole life, whether he might be conflicted about it, etc. The episode is hobbled by having to have him as both the generic villain who does the scorpion-y things, and as the focal point for this theme. Equally, the Doctor's response to him also shows how little thought has really been put into this. It's cliched generic nonsense like, you can live more in 20 years than 80, you'll see this clip in a moment. Or frankly, stuff that sounds pretty patronising coming from a guy who's lived nearly a millennia and can survive fatal injuries and diseases with only a change of faith. But the episode doesn't call out that attitude.
One lifetime's been too short for me to do everything I'd like. How much more I'll get done in 2 or 3 or 4?
Doesn't work like that. Some people live more in 20 years than others do in 80. It's not the time that matters, it's the person.
But if it's the right person, what a gift that would be.
See, he's not calling the Doctor out on it, he's responding with some egotistical, I'm a villain nonsense. I guess kind of my problem with it is that the episode seems unwilling to look at Lazarus' motivation as a rational fear, and that's where I think the problem comes from. It has already decided its position on it and makes the motivation itself become the problem instead of the actions that result from it. Now, I'm not saying don't explore that idea as in itself, whether it's moral to achieve immortality or cheat death or anything like that, But to me at least, the outrage is not that Lazarus wants to live forever, it's that doing so is resulting in unforeseen consequences that does kill several people. The episode should explore this, both the morality of immortality, as I said, but also Lazarus coming to terms with the collateral damage he is causing. It just seems uninterested in exploring it either way. I'm not saying you don't have to come to the conclusion, but he decides it's worth it, but it just seems that he's interested in even having that conversation. Another major issue is that the episode's structure also means it is mostly relegated to exposition anyway. The action doesn't build into this at all, and once the final talk between the Doctor and Lazarus has happened, the themes don't come up again and the Doctor goes all Phantom of the Opera on his ass to kill him once and for all. It's poorly delivered in the script, but at least it balances it out by being haphazardly presented and structured. Character-wise, things aren't that much better. I said this was an inferior opportunity to explore the Doctor's character through his own relationship with his longevity and mortality, and it's certainly a potentially interesting way of looking at things. The Doctor is a demonstration of the kind of character that only science fiction can explore, given how long-lived he is and how essentially unable to die through all but the most specific circumstances. This episode has no real interest in looking at that, though, again, beyond the most basic cliched dialogue the Doctor responds with. And again, it's easy for him to say that. He doesn't have to worry about wasting his life or the inevitability of death, given he's 900 years old and pretty fucking difficult to kill. There's precious little exploration of whether he truly recognises his different perspective at all. After all, if Martha had fallen off the roof of that cathedral as she did, she would have been killed. If the Doctor had, he would have just regenerated. There's precious little exploration of whether he truly recognises this different perspective. And there's equally little explanation of what should truly be outraging him, that Lazarus has murdered all these people in the name of this. The idea of the Doctor becoming weary of life because of the people he's had to leave behind and all the things that are weighing on him, that could work. I definitely think that's something to explore. But it goes nowhere because the episode only wants to pay it lip service. As for Martha, I spoke at length about the setup for her character earlier, so all I'll say is this. The idea of the arc here is fine. It's basically here finally proving to the Doctor that she deserves to be his companion and that she is capable and intelligent enough to do it. The problem is that it barely features. We're not giving the sense this is some pivotal moment where she's earned it. It feels like for her and the Doctor just another day in the office. Or it's poorly executed, the ending where the Doctor originally offers her another single trip, but eventually is guilt-tripped into letting her come full-time. Just feels petty from his point of view and undermines what the episode was going for with it. This is supposed to be her earning her place, not her earning her place and then only getting it on appeal because the Doctor is still fucking hung up on Rose. The whole presentation of it is generic as hell anyway. Martha helps the Doctor with some of the action and the science, demonstrates her doctoring skills, demonstrates her bravery, etc. and so forth. Feels like a bit of a checklist if nothing else. This also plays in when it comes to her family, and as I said at the start, it feels like a bit like they were replaying the Rose greatest hits, without realising how to make them work for this character. Her mum's hostility towards the Doctor is a potentially interesting point, but is weakened by the A, absurdly weak dialogue, and B, the fact her hostility comes from exposition we don't even hear. Her change is because she's told to change, and that's not effective. Her relationship with her mother is still explored. She's a bit overbearing and controlling, but how much of this comes from where is not looked at all. And the level of her concerns, on the one hand, Martha is going off with this bloke she's just met and putting herself in danger, which is going to set off the parental instinct. But on the other hand, Martha is a grown woman who can make her own decisions, and her mother doesn't seem willing to be respecting that. And yet the episode doesn't seem interested in actually looking at any of that, just sort of having a bit of conflict there, just not looking any deeper into it, and certainly not really bothering to resolve it. Yes, I know this was part of the series' wide arc, but the episode needed some resolution, and it gets none. She's acting as she is because, well, she's a mum, and that's how they act, right? Martha's relationship with her sister is also confused and ill-defined. It's at first hostile because her sister is, all ambitious and stuff, I think. But eventually they overcome it through the script saying they do, and her sister helps out at the end, and now their relationship is something. I'll get back to you on that. As I already spoke about Lazarus as a character in the thematic bit, I'll move on to the last thing I wanted to discuss, which is the dialogue, and specifically how it's terrible. Now, it's in a different kind of terrible from, say, Moffat dialogue, which is trying to be quirky and funny and failing miserably at it in an awkward and embarrassing way. This episode's dialogue is just bad. As in, basic, cliched, and weak. It consists of blunt statements like, "It's overloading," when we can clearly see on the screen that the device is overloading. Or his assistant going, "He actually did it," in a way that sounds sort of totally ridiculous. Not just because we can clearly fucking see he did it, but also because that's not what people ever say except in badly written fiction. It just feels like a first draft a lot of the time, and it makes it even harder to get into the already weak plot and characters. When Martha's mum is basically going to Martha, "No, stop, the Doctor's bad," it doesn't belie any complexity to the relationship. It basically is just straight up saying what's going on. And, well, portraying complexity is why good dialogue is important. There's also, separate from that dialogue, a general feeling of weak cliche. The lady who goes, "Oh, there's no danger here," and then gets killed within 30 seconds is the kind of laughably predictable cliche that only bad NuWho can really provide. Equally, there are just some sillier plot points. The whole organ stuff is just, well, my attitude on that has already been made pretty clear. I think my pick for the weakest moment of this episode is actually as the Doctor is about to play the organ, he does a little thing where he clicks his knuckles. I mean, really? Priorities? I think the problem really of this episode is actually into how Greenhorn executes it. As I said, the concept, while it is weak in its way, certainly, is not necessarily the biggest problem here. But I think in the end, how the concept story treatment was executed, that's where the problems come from. This is not an appalling or insulting episode, as I said earlier, it's just bad. It's poorly thought out, the themes are not explored or developed, and the character work is weak, but it doesn't do anything to piss me off. I mean, damning with faint praise perhaps, but that counts for a little. But not much. This is a weak episode, no question, and it's difficult to pick up much of what ended up on the screen that really works about it. Mistake A was basing the episode on a special effect that was never going to work and thus tanks the episode's credibility. Mistake B was then not doing any kind of development on the things that would have made the episode more than just a cliche-filled action romp. I'd have been happy to look past the poor effects and stupid science if the theme had been properly explored, but I felt three-dimensional characters were interacting in a believable way, but those things didn't happen either, and I'm left with really precious little to work with. With all that in mind, I'm going for a final score of 3 out of 10. It's not insulting or awful or anything like that, so it avoids anything lower, but it also sits very firmly in the very bad category. The poor effects are the cherry on top of a cake, which includes haphazard plotting, poor thematic work, and lazy characterization. Something maybe could have been done here. I think that was potential, which I'm annoyed was wasted, but ultimately there's very little to work with. It shows to me a lot of the frustration I had with NuWho as a whole. A little more focus on the important things could improve even the weaker episodes to make the series as a whole feel more consistent, but alas, we're stuck with this. Thankfully, Series 3 would improve right up until the finale would shatter all that goodwill, but this episode remains as a reminder of what can happen when it all goes wrong. An episode, if you will, that became its own version of the giant killer scorpion. No? Alright, well I thought that would work, but evidently not.